The world needs more people with curious minds. People who aren't afraid to admit when they don't know something. We need to take the time to encourage more lifelong learners. At least that's my goal with this podcast. I think the future is at stake. But at the same time, I do believe that a more informed population can and will move humanity forward. All we have to do is keep learning. What's going on, everybody? We're back. I'm super excited to be back. We're sitting in the studio right now, got the purple lights going on. If you're just listening to it, just imagine. Got a nice purple light situation going on here. It's real laid back. It's awesome. If you're watching on YouTube, you can see it. Once again, love the studio. I'm super pumped about it. These lights are crazy awesome. My siblings got them for me for my birthday. We can do like a million colors on these things. If you haven't seen them, they're the Philips Hue lights. Recommend them to everyone. If you can find these things, get them. They are awesome. They're like the coolest thing ever. One of the best gifts I've ever gotten. So we have the purple lights going on. It's pretty awesome. If you are listening to the audio version though, and you're thinking, man, I'd love to see those purple lights, then guess what? You can now head on over to YouTube and go ahead and just type into that search bar, Nick Learns Everything, and hit enter. And boom, you're right there. Got the YouTube channel up and running. I've spent a little bit of time working on the YouTube channel recently. And I guess when I say a little bit of time, I mean a ton of time. I've been trying to get some of the other infrastructure around this podcast set up. So I've been a little light on the content lately. So I do apologize to you guys for that. But we're back on a roll now. We are back, and it is awesome. So I just want to go ahead and jump on into this one. Here's the deal. I think that when I start talking about this, what this episode's going to be about, you might think to yourself, oh, come on, like this is going to be so boring. And I get it. And I think you'll understand why in a second. But just trust me. If you're new to the show, I'm going to ask you to trust me. It's going to be an entertaining episode, I assure you, but you're going to have to trust me. If you've been here for a while, welcome back. I think you know that when I tell you this is a good one, you can trust that it's going to be a good one. But I'm excited about this one. I'm excited to be back. It's a good time. It's pretty awesome. So here we go. Let's just get right into it. So I was listening to an episode of Lex Friedman's podcast, and that's an awesome podcast, by the way, if you guys haven't checked it out. He's a MIT professor, but he's like a young guy. And his podcast, he interviews a lot of like intellectual people, a lot of professors, authors, people that work in science and mathematics. It's a really cool podcast. So if you haven't checked it out, I would recommend it. Anyway, I was listening to an episode that he had, and he had on a gentleman named Eric Brynjolfsson. Yep, Eric Brynjolfsson. And to give you some background, Eric Brynjolfsson is a professor at Stanford, and he runs their digital economy lab. And according to Stanford's website, the lab is, quote, an integral component of the Stanford Institute for Human-Centered AI, serving as its primary hub for conducting research related to the economic implication of technology. Now, Dr. Brynjolfsson's research focuses on the implications of the economic implications of digital technologies and AI. So basically, this guy is entirely focused on the results that AI and digital technologies will bring for the economy. So that is sort of his focus. He's focused on economics, but as they relate to digital technology and AI more specifically. And before he was at Stanford, he was actually at MIT for 25 years. So I think we can just start this episode off by safely assuming that the things that he is talking about are areas where he is very, very comfortable, very well read. He is the expert. This is a smart guy. We're talking about Stanford and MIT, economics professor, and he's able to meld that economics knowledge with the knowledge of new technologies and AI. That is a smart guy. Like I'm like, like the filling out your taxes can sometimes be complicated, let alone figuring out all the economic implications of artificial intelligence, right? So I just kind of want to use that as some framing as we go along here. That the guest on this particular episode of Lex's podcast is very well established in the economics community. So Lex asked him a very simple question, and I thought it was a really thought provoking question, but it was basically that if we assume there are fundamental problems in taxation or some fundamental problems in the economy overall, what would you try to fix? And what would you speak to? And I think that Dr. Brynjolfsson had some really, really interesting insights, and one in particular that I want to talk about. But I'll go ahead and give you the summary of sort of everything he said to answer that question of if there's a problem with taxes or the economy, where would you start, basically? And what he said was that we don't really need to totally reinvent stuff. Basically, look at it like economics 101. We had some very simple tactics that we used in the 20th century, and then we moved away from those. Sorry, I needed a drink there. Anyway, so we had these principles in the 20th century, and they're super simple. When you hear them, you're gonna be like, those are very simple, but these are ones that we had and then we've moved away from since. And so the first is we used to invest in education far more. And we also used to invest in infrastructure far more than we do now. I think the United States at this point, I think our overall infrastructure has been rated by like the world organizations that do that type of rating at like a D plus. So our airports, our public transportation, it's awful, and I think everyone knows it. But the reality is that we used to invest in that more as well. We also used to welcome immigrants a lot more. Immigrants that wanted to come and work. We it was a lot easier for them to participate in the economy in the 20th century compared to the 21st century. We also had a more fair tax system. So the taxes on high income people have actually come down since the 20th century, was one of the things that he noted in this interview. And those are all sort of examples of things that he feels like we've moved away from that would be easy fixes to any issues like were posed in the question originally, any issues revolving around taxation or fundamental problems with our economy. And he then went on to mention a very specific solution that he thinks could be a possibility. And that solution is Pigouvian taxes. And that's what I really want to get into in this episode. So think about Pigouvian taxes as taxes that are placed on things that are bad, not things that are good. So we already have some of this in the economy when you think of like a sin tax on alcohol or cigarettes, something like that. You're taxing something that is a bad thing in that it is not good for us physically, right? We can all agree that alcohol and cigarettes are not good for us physically, and they are taxed more. It's a bad thing being taxed more than a good thing, right? What's a good thing that is taxed? Well, income, for example. Property taxes, for example. Those are good things. Those are things that we want people to have. We want people to have an income. We want them to have property, and yet we tax them. And so the idea of Pigouvian taxes is basically that we need to shift to a system that taxes more of the bad things and not so many of the good things. So Dr. Brynjolfsson goes on to talk about, as he's answering this question, this idea of Pigouvian taxes. And it was really cool because it's like I knew the idea of sin taxes existed, right? But to find out that you have this model that basically takes that system and applies it to everything was just really cool. So I just like really enjoyed listening to him explain it. And once again, I just kind of give you a summary of some of the stuff that he was saying about Pigouvian taxes. So right now we tax things like labor and capital, like I talked about. And a basic economic principle says that if you tax something, you tend to get less of it. I think that's something that we can all understand fundamentally. That seems kind of obvious almost. But his solution to any sort of issues with the tax problem is that what we could do that's a little more practical is we could tax things like pollution and congestion. These are things that are not good for society. Having more pollution, having more traffic congestion, both of those things are not good for society. And if it's true that we follow that basic principle of economics, which is if you tax something, you tend to get less of it, why would we not tax those things to create less congestion and pollution if we're able to? If there's a mechanism that exists that allows us to tax those things, and that's what these Pigouvian taxes allow us to do. So, in the pollution example, he talks about a carbon tax, right? And he actually spoke to, which I thought was really cool because he's obviously a professor of economics at Stanford and MIT. We're talking about a very smart guy, and he actually said that as much as the media wants to make you think that politically we are at odds over the idea of like a carbon tax, for example, to try to curb pollution, it's really not the case. So he pointed to the example in this interview that Greg Mankiw, who was the head of George W. Bush's Council of Economic Advisors, even agrees with Democrats on the idea that a carbon tax would be good. So a carbon tax, because it relates to climate change, as anything that relates to climate change, gets very uh, political very quickly. And all of a sudden, that turns into this tribal nature that we have, right, politically. So all of a sudden, it's like this argument sort of breaks out, and everybody, I think, assumes that there's these two sides with these two ideas. But like he said, the carbon tax itself among economists is seems to be um, something that they think of very positively. Now, I'll be honest with you. I've seen people that say there are more debates around this subject than you would think. But it's nice to see a guy, at least in this instance, that's in the know, sort of speak to the fact that, to be honest, like there does seem to be some agreement that a carbon tax would be a good thing. And what Dr. Brynjolfsson said is that the money that you could raise through a carbon tax can be used for a variety of different things, but all of which are very helpful to sort of the population as a whole, right? You could take that money that you're getting from the carbon tax and you could put it into an earned income tax credit, which is basically essentially just putting more money into the hands of everyday working people instead of corporations, right? And in fairness, if you really think about it, why shouldn't a company that's polluting the atmosphere, and we know pollution is not good, be taxed more for that pollution, right? Right now, we have these systems that sort of incentivize green energy. You get these tax subsidies that incentivize companies going green, like Google and Amazon. It's why those companies don't pay a lot in taxes. If you ever see something in the news about that like Amazon doesn't pay any taxes, part of the reason is because they just use the tax incentives by going green to be able to get their revenue, more of their revenue is able to be written off, and they have all these like tax subsidies and a bunch of these other mechanisms. And I'll be honest, like I'm not the guy to ask about the specific details of every single one, but they have a lot of mechanisms in place that incentivize going green. However, we don't really have a lot in place that decentivize pollution, right? So that's what he's talking about there. Now, when it comes to the congestion tax, and we're going to get into that a little more later, basically what he said was you have a lot of costs associated with traffic. And I like to use this as the main example because everybody can relate to traffic, right? Especially if you live in or around a big city, you're very familiar with that sort of I don't know how to say it. It's just sort of like the depressing nature of traffic, right? Like I am from suburban Chicago, right? My dad sits in that traffic every day. My future father-in-law sits in that traffic every day. It's brutal. My mom commuted to work, I mean, like maybe 15 miles from our house, and it would take her an hour sometimes in suburban Chicago. And I know that's true in cities all over the place. It's brutal. Honestly, it's probably worse than that. I'm just throwing that out there as like an example off the top of my head. It was probably worse. She could probably tell me stories where that drive took her 2 hours to go 15, 20 miles, right? And so the costs that are associated with that traffic are all related back to productivity. Like we are paying for that traffic in a variety of ways. And a congestion tax would create more efficient travel patterns because you would be forced to, right? Once again, if we agree on that basic principle, and I think it's important that we agree on that, but if we do agree on that principle that if you tax something you get less of it, then in theory, if you tax the congestion, you would create more efficient travel, and because people would want to avoid that tax, and then it would streamline the roads. Now, what he also says is that that money could be available for things that are potentially related to traffic itself, right? So you could use that money that's generated from the congestion tax to fund infrastructure, for example. You could get better roads, you could get better public transportation, you could have better airports if you use the money generated by the congestion tax to fund those things. Now, he also says, and I like this quote, but I think it sums it up well. He says, quote, sitting in a traffic jam is basically like taxing me and then dumping the money into the ocean, which is true. Like we can agree, if we can agree that the cost of traffic is less productivity, and that I shouldn't say that the cost, like that's the only cost of it, but one of the costs of it is that loss of productivity. Another one is the fact that obviously we're polluting more. If everybody's just sitting around and our cars are pumping exhaust into the atmosphere, there's obviously a cost there, right? And so you have all these costs associated with traffic. And yet we're losing that money. And so his point, I think, is good. It really is like you are taxing us anyway, but the money doesn't get used for anything that helps us. And from his perspective, the majority of people that know about our economy at the most fundamental levels, right? The economists, the professors at universities, right? The people that work in the very, very bones of our economy. In his opinion, the majority of them wouldn't think these are radical ideas at all. And I think that is always an important signal, right? Because if you have someone that's, like I said, in the know, and their opinion is that other people like them think one way or another way about something, I understand there's some biases, right? I totally get that. But we are looking at the expert here. And when he's saying a lot of the other experts agree with him too, you can't really make an argument to me that this is a radical idea. Um, at, at at best, you could make an argument to me that you're not sure, right? Like you feel a little uneasy about some of the aspects of it. But to be honest, like I do think it's important that in life we try to trust the experts on things, right? I think like a lot of what goes on nowadays is everybody wants to be an expert on everything. Nobody wants to admit that they don't know something, and so everybody all of a sudden isn't willing to trust the experts, and things have become more conspiratorial over time, right? So the experts, if you don't understand that thing, it's easy to explain away by saying it's some sort of conspiracy. And I just think that it's important to look for the the right markers, right? And I think a guy like this saying that him and his colleagues agree on these things is a great marker to know that this might be something important. Now, he finishes up by basically saying that we could do all these things and it would make our economy more efficient and more fair. And we would be able to invest more into research and development. And I'll be honest, this is the only thing that he said in the interview, or at least all of the interview that I saw, where I think you could point to a little bias. I mean, obviously, he's going to say that if we did these things, the money generated could be used towards research and development because at the end of the day, like he is a professor working on research and development, right? So I think him saying that's where he would like to see the money spent is like, okay, of course, there's a little bias there. But there's no like secret plot that this guy's up to outside of that. Like he's not fucking walking around thinking to himself, like, all right, like I'm gonna go on Lex Friedman's podcast and pitch these crazy ideas because it'll help me make like I don't think that's what's going on there. So you could say there's a little bias there, and now he wants to spend the money, but I don't think it'd be fair to say there's much more of a bias after that. I just think this seems to be like a legitimate option that we could look at is these Pigouvian taxes. Now, ultimately, after learning all of this, I think there is a larger point that I'm trying to make, really, with this whole idea. And that's the fact that what I really think we need is what I would call just a real education on alternatives. Like, as a population, I feel like we don't get enough alternatives. Like, everything is like, okay, these are your choices. And there's just certain instances like this one where there must be more options, right? Like I'm not an economics professor, I'm not a lawyer, I'm not a tax expert, but essentially what it seems like to me is that the government pitches tax plans to us every election cycle as basically you have a choice between one of these two plans. You either go with the Republican plan or the Democrat plan. That's it. We just have these two plans, one or the other, every election cycle. That's it. And basically, those plans are just a giant combination of really long and really confusing tax laws and a bunch of bullshit, and like a lot of economic plans. And I don't even think the people that are forming a lot of these plans fully understand them. I definitely don't think that the people that are pitching them to us fully understand them. And to use a sports analogy, I feel like what happens is the government sort of acts as the head coach and they go out and sell the vision or the game plan to us. We're like the team. And they're like, here's the vision, here's the game plan. And this is it. Like these are the options. Like we're pitching it to you. And then after the fact, if it works and people are happy, they take the praise for it. And if it doesn't work, they take the blame for it, right? But I I saw a YouTube comment on the video and it mentioned Stockholm syndrome, and I think that's a great point because it seems like we're held hostages by the aspects of these systems, like this tax system. Like you either get this one or that one, that's it. It's these two, they're kind of the same, and we can't really explain them well enough to you for you to feel like it makes any sense. Like they dumb it down, right? Like everything's like it just less or more, like as if we as the population can't understand like a simple discussion about these things, right? And we almost do have that Stockholm syndrome. Like we're held hostages by the aspects of this tax system, and we all of a sudden start to defend them at times, and we accept them. And I just thought that Stockholm syndrome metaphor was a good one because it does feel like that sometimes. And in reality, this isn't our only choice. Like there are a host of other options that we could slowly and thoughtfully transition into. And I think these Pigouvian taxes are one of them. Like when it comes to taxes in the United States, it isn't this left or right, red or blue issue. And I think it's important that we understand at times that we do have more options. And that's why I say, like, we need to be educated on our alternatives, right? So we can get away from the status quo in some of these areas. No one likes taxes. Like, everybody fucking hates taxes. Like, I'm not a proponent of more taxes at all. Who is? Everybody hates taxes. But at least I could feel better about them if they were going, like, if they were going to things that I like or I should actually not going to, but if they were like taxing bad things instead of good things, right? And then giving the money to like fix actual issues, right? not like salaries for and all this bullshit. Like I think most people feel that way. Like most people feel that way. So I think it's important to understand that there are alternatives. Now, you know the video like that I mentioned I saw like the interview, like the particular clip that I saw from this interview. To this day, only has 8,500 views on YouTube. That's it. Remember, this is a video of a Harvard graduate who's now a Stanford professor, and all he's doing is simply explaining an alternative tax system, and that video only has 8,500 views. That's such a low number. Like, that's a crazy low number. What that means is, out of the entire world, the amount of people that have seen that video could fit inside the Tucson Center in Arizona. And I know that sounds like a joke, but it's seriously not. The Tucson Center in Arizona holds more than 8,500 people. And every single one of the 190 biggest indoor arenas in the United States can fit more people than have seen that video. Meanwhile, if you go on YouTube, it's full of videos that explain how taxes work as if there's no other options, or videos blaming or blaming this guy for his tax plan is actually going to hurt people, or this guy's tax plan is way better, and they're all basically the same thing. It's all the status quo. Meanwhile, you got a video that's talking about a totally alternative option, and it's got 8,500 views. So once again, I just think the overall theme of this podcast episode is that we need to be educated on our alternatives. Now, I do want to make a distinction here. I am not saying that a fully Pigouvian tax system is the answer. I don't know what the answer is. Like I don't know. I don't know the exact perfect tax plan. And that's not what really this episode's about. What I'm more concerned with is the fact that it took me this long to learn about this option. But I do think it's important to make a case for transitioning to a more Pigouvian tax model. We really need to stop taxing income and property and start taxing things like traffic and pollution and waste instead. I really think that isn't that crazy that we would start to transition into some more Pigouvian systems. Now, I understand that there are people that will disagree with the idea of implementing any of these types of taxes in America. They don't want to even hear the word taxes, and I totally get that. But for some people that are against it, I want to remind you that we already have them in the form of those sin taxes I was talking about with alcohol and cigarettes. So I do think it's important to note that if you don't think this is a good idea, I understand that. However, you have to acknowledge, though, that we do already do it. So that is an important piece of this. But I also think that there are some people who are opposed to what I'm saying, and they're opposed to any taxes like this because they think that I'm talking about implementing them on the federal level. And what I'm asking you to consider is to look at it at more of like a local level, state level, and then local level, right? Cities and towns. I think that is important because I turn to the example of Singapore and their congestion tax that Dr. Brynjolfsson had mentioned. And I turn to that to make my argument because you might be thinking like, oh, Nick, that's Singapore. And of course they can pull that off because it's so small. We can never do that here in America. It's too populated. But Singapore has a population that's more than double that of the city of Houston, Texas, with half the land area. So when I say like the state and local level, like cities, for example, I do think it's applicable. I really do. There's a lot of potential for traffic in a place like Singapore, where once again, they have twice the population of Houston and half the area. There's a potential for a ton of traffic. So I think when you look at it like that, it's it's proof that it can absolutely be done here on a more local level. Now, the other thing to keep in mind is that Singapore is the fourth richest country on earth. So you also have to keep that in mind. This if you're not super familiar with like some of these other countries, you might not have an understanding of actually how wealthy Singapore is. So I think if you're trying to take that spin on how could it work here because Singapore is nothing like this, I really do think at that state and local level it really is. It's really comparable. And so I would direct you to an article that was written by Luca Ventura for Global Finance, and he says, quote, "How did Singapore become so prosperous? When the city-state became independent in 1965, one half of its population was illiterate. 50 hold on. 50% of the people couldn't read. Think about what I'm telling you. 50% of the people could not read in 1965. Half the people couldn't read. And he also says, quote, they have virtually no natural resources. But Singapore pulled itself up by its bootstraps through hard work and smart policy, becoming one of the most business-friendly places in the world. In 1965, half of their population could not read. And today, in 2021, they're the fourth richest country in the world. And the most important phrase that he says there is smart policy. So Singapore's been at this since the 1970s, and I think it shows. The congestion tax structure has led Singapore to being one of the least congested cities in the entire world. Now, part of the reason that they have less traffic is because the tax system incentivizes the population to take public transportation because it saves them a lot of money. So basically, like part of the tax structure that they have is like certain roads, the tolls on those roads are more expensive at certain times, like rush hour and stuff like that. And then also, it's very expensive to own a car there. And so, because of that, they're more reliable on public transportation. But the public transportation there is phenomenal. Like, it isn't like America. They're not sitting over there in some sort of sad dystopian reality where no one can own a car, so they all got to ride the fucking Wild West that is public transportation in America. Like, that's not a thing. Like, they're not dealing with the same type of issues we are. So they do use public transportation more, and that is a result of having this Pigouvian tax structure. But you can't make the mistake of conflating the two, like as if it's like, oh, they're just like their public transportation is just like America. Like that'd be pretty sad if we all had to do that. It's nothing like it is here, and I know that's critical, but it's true. Our public transportation is awful, and I want to point here to a report that was done by McKinsey. So if you're not familiar with McKinsey, McKinsey is one of the largest consulting companies in the world. Um, if you're really not familiar with that world, just think about it like when you think of like somebody who is like in business, like I'm a businessman or I'm a businesswoman, right? One of those people, they do that for a career. They make a lot of money doing business consulting. That is what McKinsey is doing. McKinsey is hired by companies all over the world, some of the biggest companies in the world, and basically they are the problem solvers. They come in and solve any problem you have. They're full of like Ivy League graduates. There's Olympians that work there. There's people that are Rhodes Scholars work there. So this is a serious consulting company, and the reason that I point to them is because they published a report in June of 2018 that was titled Elements of Success, Urban Transportation Systems of 24 Global Cities. And in that report, they found that 86% of the population is, quote, satisfied with the overall situation in public transport. And 71% are satisfied with the overall situation in private transport. So think about that. In today's day and age, especially if you live in America, finding 86% of the population is happy with something, or 71% even is happy with something, is tremendous. Now, what's also important to note is that McKinsey also looked at Chicago, and let's just say that in that instance, the situation was not as satisfying to the residents when it came to transportation. And look, I get the idea that cars being more expensive and some of these taxes might freak you out. I get that the idea of having to ride public transportation everywhere might be a deal breaker for you. But just remember that once again, what I'm saying is we could adopt some of this structure. I'm not saying that every single city has to do the exact same thing as Singapore. Like, we have a lot of really smart people in America who I think could just take some of the aspects of these systems, some of the aspects of what Singapore is doing correctly, and apply them here in a way that would make sense, that people would be comfortable with. I'm not saying we have to go to some model that looks exactly like them. I'm just saying it seems like there's some very obvious, very practical um options that we have that already exist. And so I would love to see some of those used here. But once again, I think like policy change is our best chance there. And that's tough right now. It's truth the truth. It's just the truth of the matter, to be honest. So I think at the end of the day, I think it's an interesting topic because of that idea of alternatives, right? Like, if you're listening to this right now and you're like, honestly, Nick, I didn't even know like that type of taxation was an option. Like, I didn't even really realize it. And I think that's awesome. Like, I think that's awesome because I think that right there proves my point. Like, you guys shouldn't have to listen to me, like, to learn about this. Like, you know what I'm saying? Like at the end of the day, like, I don't know what I'm talking about. I'm not like some sort of like genius economics professor who has all the answers here. But like, you shouldn't have to listen to me, and I'm some guy on YouTube is the one who like explains this alternative option to you. I just wish there was a situation where we had more of that information available to us so we could know the wide range of possibilities that we have, honestly, when it comes to our money. And so, I say I wish that were the case, but I am trying to, through this podcast, just hopefully one person learns about this, and we can start to educate the population on these type of alternatives to the status quo. But once again, at the end of the day, like, you know, who knows what I'm even talking about? Like, let me tell you, I found out that my fiance's cousin has a dog that has more Instagram followers than me. So the reality is, like, everything I'm saying on here, like, I'm just a guy on YouTube talking. Like, it's, I don't have all the solutions here, and I don't pretend to. But with that being said, I think we can all agree, let's just keep learning new shit so we can continue to educate ourselves more and more about our options. We can keep learning about these alternatives. I really do think the world is a better place when the population en masse knows about these alternatives, right? How about instead of 8,500 people listening to, to be honest with you, an expert talk about this, right? How about we get in a situation where instead of 8,500, it's 85 million, right? And I think that is our best chance to move forward and our best chance to get those policies implemented. Is just more people to be educated on our alternatives to the status quo. But anyway, guys, if you like this episode and you want to support the show, there's a couple ways you can do that. You can subscribe to the podcast just on whatever podcast platform. That would be awesome. I would really appreciate it. If you go that route, please, and I'll say this same thing if you subscribe to the YouTube channel. If you subscribe to the podcast audio itself, if you could please leave a review, that would help me out a ton. So if you want to support the show, it's a great way to do it on the audio side. And then on the video side, if you subscribe to the YouTube channel, if you could go ahead and, hit that like button for me on any of the videos that we have up there, as well as that notification bell. If you see that little bell, if you hit that, you'll be able to be notified whenever I post a new video. So that would be a great way if you're looking to support the podcast. That would really help me out a lot. Also, I've been posting more of these YouTube clips up on my YouTube channel as well as on Instagram. So if you could share those, if you know somebody that might like this podcast, if you could tell them, that would be awesome. Like, I know it sounds simple, like I really do, but if you're looking for a way to support, like, that would just help me out a ton. So thank you guys. Thank you for listening. I'm super excited to be back. I'm gonna start churning these episodes out. I'm telling you, I'm very excited. But anyway, Thanks for tuning in. Shout out to all my family and friends as always, and I will see you guys next time.